I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about recent events and elections in Venezuela in which President Nicolas Maduro was, quote unquote, reelected, that's in some dispute, we have with us our America's Program Director, Ryan Berg. Ryan, I just want to go to this news right away. The New York Times reported yesterday that Juan Carlos Del Pino, a member of Venezuela's National Electoral Council, a 5-member body that was charged with overseeing the election, has said that he failed the country and that the election failed the country in proclaiming President Nicolas Maduro the victor in elections last month. This is pretty groundbreaking news. I think this election has been in dispute since the results came out. Can you put this into context for us?
Andrew, it's always a pleasure to be with you on The Truth of the Matter. Thanks for having me. Indeed, I think what Juan Carlos Del Pino is getting at is that Nicolas Maduro is attempting to pull off what many consider to be the mother of all electoral frauds in Latin American history. What he's referring to is the meetings that should have taken place at the National Electoral Council in the run-up to the July 28th elections. These meetings would have been setting certain policies and standards for the election on the 28th. Those meetings didn't happen. Those meetings were canceled and decisions were made unilaterally by the regime-controlled head of the National Electoral Council, Elvis Amoroso, who is under U.S. sanction. And those decisions were all made in private, in consultation with President Maduro, of course, to benefit his election campaign. The other thing that Juan Carlos Del Pino is referring to is that on election night, as the votes were being tabulated, a mysterious outage in the transmission of the votes from the various polling centers around the country to Caracas, where they are tabulated and where the final result is announced, those stopped all of a sudden. And of course, that got all of us worrying that our greatest fears were transpiring and that indeed a fake result was going to be announced by the National Electoral Commission. After several hours of waiting in suspense, the National Electoral Commission said that the delay was due to a cyber attack that was launched from North Macedonia. There's no indication that that is actually true. And later, the regime's narrative has changed to the fact that it was Elon Musk from California. There's no indication that that is true. But nevertheless, around midnight or slightly after midnight on election day, the CNE announced results of 80% of the polls saying that the result was irreversible for President Maduro and that these were the results. But the CNE, as it's known, didn't show any of the vote tabulations. Venezuela's electoral machines create vote tabulations that have QR codes. It's very secure. It's a 2-step process. And it didn't show any of those tabulations proving its victory. Meanwhile, the opposition was able to mobilize really an incredible network of volunteer election monitors. It was able to accredit them before the CNE, and it was able to station them at many of the polling stations around the country. Those volunteer witnesses were able to get their hands on quite a few of the vote tabulations. Now the opposition is in possession of more than 83% of the results from the voting spots around the country, and those show a more than 2-to-1 victory for the opposition candidate Edmundo González Urrutia. And so what they've done is put these results up on a website for the entire world to see, and they've tried to bind the Maduro regime's hands by saying, you need to show the vote tabulations to prove that you won. If you don't show the vote tabulations to prove that you won, we can't say that this was a legitimate election.
Right. So just to clarify, neither the electoral body, CNE, nor President Maduro has released tallies to support his assertions that he won re-election, while the opposition, Edmundo González, has published receipts from thousands of voting machines showing that its candidate, Edmundo González, won an overwhelming victory. So it's not at all as it seems.
That's right, Andrew. And let's pause for a second to admire the irony here. The voting machines were in fact put in place by Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who worried that the opposition would engage in an election theft against him. And so he wanted a 2-step voting process that was very secure with QR codes, and with printouts of vote tabulations from each voting station. Those, in fact, have now been used against his successor, Nicolas Maduro, to prove that there was an election theft. And the fact that the opposition has those voting records and is able to publish them has kept a lot of countries in the world, especially in Latin America, allies of the Maduro government otherwise, from recognizing his victory, because what they would be doing is openly recognizing a fraud. And so even if a country, say Brazil or Colombia, has not recognized the regime's fraud, they have at least said Maduro needs to show the vote tabulations in order to prove that he won. And if he doesn't, and if he can't do that, we're not going to recognize him as the president.
Ryan, I want to ask you, how is this playing out on the ground in Venezuela? The closest I got to it was our driver in Miami, a really cool guy named Eddie, who's from Venezuela. And we talked baseball the whole time because I didn't want to ask him about the sad state of the country since the election in late July. I mean, what we're seeing down there is nothing but fear and repression, isn't it?
I think it's a double-edged sword, Andrew. Yes, there is a lot of repression. The regime has unleashed an onslaught of repression in the wake of this stolen election. And mostly they've released an onslaught of repression because Venezuelans are in the street. They were in the street after the election results were announced. They've been in the street periodically since the election theft that took place on the evening of the 28th to demand that the votes actually be counted. And one of the things that's most interesting about this, Andrew, is we are now seeing people who not only voted for the opposition from traditional strongholds of the ruling Chavista party, but also people who are willing to risk their lives going out into the street from traditional strongholds of the ruling party to demand that their vote be counted. And that's something different that we haven't seen in the past. The mobilization is taking place across the political spectrum, across the income spectrum, that hasn't been seen in past uprisings in Venezuela. So this is going to be a very tricky one for Maduro to get out of. And so far, his only tool has been brute force. The regime has unleashed some very significant repression. There are nearly 2,000 people who've been imprisoned already. The regime is going door to door and marking doors with a big black X if they suspect them of having participated in the protests. They are filming arrests of leaders as they break into their homes and setting them to the backdrop of Christmas carols, for example, and publishing them on social media to sow terror and fear and distrust. The overall strategy is simply to create facts on the ground and to get away from the discussion of showing the vote tabulations and getting more to a discussion of some kind of negotiations to reduce the violence, the repression, the political persecution, while ignoring the conversation about the fact that Maduro has to leave. He didn't win the election, and there should be a democratic transition that is negotiated for him to have a safe exit out of power. Those conversations aren't happening now because everybody is focused both on the vote tabulations, but also on the repression and what can we do to stop these levels of repression.
How violent is the repression on the ground? What does it look like right now?
Well, every time the opposition calls for protests, let me back up for a second, Andrew. I shouldn't say opposition because it's not opposition any longer. That's an important point to make here. It's really a country against its government. There, as I mentioned, there are folks who are sympathetic to Chavismo as a political movement, voted for Hugo Chavez, perhaps even voted for Nicolas Maduro a few times, and have now had enough. And they voted for change, and they wouldn't consider themselves to be typical opposition, but they too are out in the streets because they're demanding that their voice and their vote actually be counted. So this is really a society against its government. And every time a society mobilizes against its government, the regime is employing repression tactics. It sends regime thugs out into the streets to scare and intimidate protesters. The National Guard is usually out in the street. The police is a key part of the repression. There have been, as I said, almost 2,000 arrests. There have been dozens of journalists who have been arrested. Prominent opposition figures have been arrested. This has been clear if you look at a snapshot series of photos of Maria Corina Machado and those who are around her at the opposition protests, Andrew. The crowd around her is getting thinner and thinner in terms of the number of leaders who are on that truck as it moves through the sea of people because there have been so many arrests. Maduro has announced on TV that two of the nation's most feared prisons will be renovated in order to handle political prisoners, and that there will be re-education and hard labor camps instituted within them. So this is a full-scale repressive state clamping down on people because they know that this is basically the last line of defense between them and a democratic transition. The best way to put it, Andrew, is they've gotten their hand stuck or caught in the cookie jar. In past elections, the opposition hasn't managed to get its hands on all of these vote tabulations. This time they have. They've put it on a website for everybody to see. And so they're having a lot of trouble getting out of this massive theft.
So tell me, what has the international community's response been to all this?
First, let's start with the US. The US has decided to let Latin American countries lead on this issue and has done most of its work behind the scenes. The Wall Street Journal reported that the US offered Maduro and his cronies blanket immunity for any country in the world that they would want to go to. They would try to facilitate that and drop all of the charges against him, drop the reward against him, try to provide him some kind of safe exit from power. Meanwhile, there are a couple different groups of Latin American countries that have been leading on this. First is what I would call the leftist sympathizers of Maduro. As I mentioned before, they haven't yet recognized the election results. They're still demanding that Maduro show the vote tabulations proving that he won. However, they haven't declared Edmundo Gonzalez president-elect or the winner of the election, as other countries have done. And so they have a middle position on this, where they are negotiating with Maduro. They're trying to reduce levels of repression. But there are real questions at stake here, Andrew, about whether this is providing Maduro with more time to create facts on the ground, more time to allow the international community to get distracted by other things in the Middle East or the war in Ukraine, and to hope that the pressure lightens up on him. And then there's another group of Latin American countries led by Panama and the Dominican Republic and several others who are demanding a negotiated transition begin. And the negotiations would last between now and the inauguration in January for some kind of exit out for Maduro, where perhaps some of his cronies stay, but certainly Edmundo Gonzalez is installed as the president of Venezuela, with guarantees for the election winners and the election losers on both sides. And importantly, the Dominican Republic offered its platform recently at the inauguration of President Luis Abinader to a second term. They offered their platform at the inauguration to pass a very important regional document signed onto by 22 countries in the EU called the Declaration of Santo Domingo, which has a number of principles that should be respected in any kind of negotiated democratic transition in Venezuela. So what I'm saying here, Andrew, is there are a lot of different parties that are working here trying to solve this crisis. Some of them are working at cross purposes. There's a lot of noise on Venezuela right now, but it's really unclear if Maduro is responsive to any of this. So far, the regime's response has been, we're going to remain in power. We're going to continue repressing. And we won the election. And here are the results fabricated out of thin air, and you will accept those results. There has been no inkling so far that the regime is willing to have any kind of discussions or discourse about their departing power.
Ryan, how likely is Maduro to succeed in maintaining his power, and what would the implications of him continuing on with his regime be?
So our base case at CSIS, unfortunately, was that Maduro would be able to hang on to power, mostly because he's thoroughly corrupted not just the elite political class in Venezuela, but also the national army. And he has a significant repressive apparatus at his disposal. In addition to which, he can count on the reliable support of authoritarian allies like China and Russia, to a lesser extent Cuba and Iran, in order to survive if his regime is in trouble. So our base case, it sounds not so sanguine, Andrew, but our base case is that he is able to survive this. However, what the opposition has managed to do, I think, is nothing short of historic. They've managed to stay together. They've managed to win an election by all accounts. And they've managed to catch the regime in a massive electoral fraud. And those things over time will weaken the regime internally. This is an army that is supporting a regime that can't even win a highly unfree and unfair election. In fact, they lost by a ratio of more than 2 to 1. And so over time, I think that tends to have deleterious effects on the level of support that one can expect within the political elite and within the key institutions like the armed forces. So that transition is not going to happen overnight. But I think it's safe to say that even if our base case proves or holds and Maduro stays in power, he's incredibly weakened. And in this instance, he doesn't even have the backing of key regional allies like Brazil and Colombia, and to a lesser extent, Mexico, who would otherwise be typically the ones immediately recognizing the election result. And so it may be short of what we had hoped for, which was a full democratic transition on the basis of an overwhelming electoral victory by the opposition. But they have managed to catch him in this tremendous electoral fraud. And they've also managed, I think, to weaken him internally. Now, unfortunately, the results of him, the effects rather of him staying in office, is nothing short of catastrophic. There were some polls that were done before the election by credible pollsters polling Venezuelans on their likelihood to leave if Maduro would stay in power. The term in Venezuela lasts for 6 years. And so Venezuelans were asked to think about what they would do and whether they would vote with their feet if Maduro would stay in office between now and 2031. And 40% of them said that they would think about leaving. And a significant percentage of those 40% said that they would think about leaving even before the inauguration in January of 2025. So what the US and the international community and Latin America, most importantly, should think about and prepare themselves for is another massive wave of Venezuelan migration, because folks have simply lost hope, especially when they think about Maduro staying in office until 2031.
Ryan, tell us, what are the next steps for Maduro and his administration? And what do you think the next steps, his opponents, who are the real victors of this election, what are they likely to take?
So let's first start on Maduro's side. Maduro is busy, as we've written at CSIS, creating what we call facts on the ground. He's busy trying to get the international community to accept his narrative of the events, because that narrative has shifted so many times, focusing on the North Macedonia attack, then on Elon Musk, then on all sorts of other excuses as to why they can't actually show the tabulations that prove that they won. They've now shifted to create other facts on the ground, which involve legalizing a lot of this reality. What I mean by that is they've brought some boxes that nobody has looked inside, but they've brought dozens of boxes to the Supreme Court in Venezuela, and they asked the Supreme Court to perform what they call an expert review on the election results. Everybody knew what the results of the expert review from the Supreme Court would be before the Supreme Court issued its ruling last Friday. But surprise, the Supreme Court said that the election was legitimate, it was fair. Maduro won with 52 or so percent of the vote, and that they had reviewed all of the ballots. Many of us suspect that those boxes were empty because the regime doesn't have the vote tabulations to prove that they won. But the point here is that they're trying to make it seem as though they're going through some of the institutions in the country to declare victory and to certify the legitimacy of Maduro's presidency. The problem for them is the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over elections. That is the unique jurisdiction of the National Electoral Council. The Supreme Court doesn't have the right to certify an election. So what they're trying to do is kind of make up processes on the fly in order to get some more countries to recognize this quote unquote victory for Maduro. Meanwhile, the National Assembly in Venezuela has been incredibly busy passing legislation that builds on some of the repressive apparatus that Maduro has been employing already. So they've passed, for example, a very repressive NGO law, which is meant to shutter a lot of civil society organizations, especially those that receive funding from outside of Venezuela. Another way that they can put pressure on groups that they see as a nuisance to this electoral theft. Human rights organizations, organizations that track repression or that track corruption, for example, will be prime targets. They've also passed something that they call the anti-hate law, which is so expansive in its definition that it basically casts anyone as an opponent of this government as a fascist who must either be arrested or silenced. And so the repressive apparatus is only getting bigger. And it's clear that the regime is simply going to found the basis of its next term simply on the basis of being able to repress and keep people silent in this massive electoral theft. Now, for the opposition, their key is nonviolent political protest. Maria Corina Machado has been very, very clear about that. And she has been very strategic in terms of the amount of repression that she's exposed people to. What I mean by that is the opposition, I think, has learned from past protests and past waves of repression that you cannot expect people to be out in the streets every single day. You need to call important protests periodically, which is to say every 10 days, every 2 weeks. You need to be very mindful about the amount of times you expose massive groups of people to this level of state repression. And I think the Maria Corina Machado folks and Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia folks have been very smart about the amount that they are looking to expose people to this repressive apparatus. Moreover, they've called for families, children, grandfathers, grandmothers, whole families to come out and protest in ways that would make that moral distinction between the violence the state is using and those who are peacefully declaring that they would like their vote to be counted all the more stark. And what they're hoping for is twofold. First, a break within the regime, that the moral distinction of repression against unarmed, peaceful protesters, making the most basic of demands, Andrew, that their vote be counted, contrasts with the level of repression that the state is going to use, and that something breaks free in the security apparatus, and barring that the regime finds it in its best interest to engage in some kind of negotiated exit with the United States, with other countries in Latin America, with the international community, in exchange for immunity, some kind of protection against prosecution, and a safe passage to a third country.
Ryan, this is something we're going to be watching. Maduro is to be inaugurated in January, and if he does take office again, it'll be another 6 years for his presidency. So I'm sure we'll be talking well before then and watching as things develop in Venezuela. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. I appreciate it as always.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.